Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah everyone. Welcome back to a new seminar in our series at Monzer University, the Institute of Islamic Economics and Finance. Today our guest is one of the most prominent names in the field of Islamic economics and finance. He contributed immensely to this field, both academically and professionally. Professor Monzer received his PhD from Utah University. He has served in several academic institutions, including the Islamic Research and Training Institute of the Islamic Development Bank in Jeddah, Hamad bin Khalifa University, and now he's currently a professor at Sabahdin Zain University at the Department of Islamic Economics and Finance. He has worked as also financial advisor and consultant, and he's the author of several books and articles who constitute a large part of the repertoire of the Islamic economics and finance literature. Professor Monzer, welcome back amongst us. This is not your first time. How are you? I hope you are doing well. And thank you for accepting our invitation. And without further ado, please, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, welcome for Ramadan, and inshallah Ramadan Mubarak for everybody who are with us here or online with us. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. The title, as you notice, is Property Theory of Islamic Finance. Of course, after Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, what happened historically that modern Islamic finance really started with the Mid-Ghamar experience. There was another experience which was not discovered really until several years later, but Mid-Ghamar experience was in fact an association of saving and investment, but it was called bank because it was the first thing that does something that banks do. First thing in the Muslim world, in the Arab countries especially, so many of the writers called it bank, Islamic banks, and it went on as such as Islamic bank. And we thought because of that, that Islamic banking means that we collect savings from individuals on mudaraba basis, and if we collect them on mudaraba basis, we should also give them on mudaraba basis. This is where the idea and the concept of risk sharing came, that risk sharing became so much attached to Islamic finance that it becomes really the definition of Islamic finance in many minds, and wherever you look at the internet, you will find the word risk sharing as really the basis of Islamic finance. There was another experiment in Malaysia, but there they never called it bank. They called it fund, and it was really under, I should say, very heavy regulation and supervision by the government, to the extent that many people thought of it as a department of the government. It was under the supervision of the Prime Minister office. That was the Tabung Haji. Tabung Haji was doing the same thing really, that is collecting savings and investing them and distributing profit to these, but it was never called bank, so it did not take that spirit that bank should be based on risk sharing. That idea became kind of dominant to a large extent, and most writings were based on the idea of risk sharing. But then Islamic banks started. The experiment of Mid-Ghamar started in 1973, but it was abruptly dissolved by the dictatorship there in Egypt at that time. I think in 1966 or beginning of 67. Few years later, the first Islamic bank, which happened to be the international one, the Islamic Development Bank, was agreed on for its establishment in 1973. That was several years after the collapse, not really the collapse, but the abrupt dissolution of the experiment of Meet Ghamar. Then came in 1975 the Dubai Islamic Bank, and some other banks came later. None of them, the Islamic Development Bank at the international level, intergovernmental, and the Dubai Islamic Bank, and later Kuwait Islamic Bank under the name of Kuwait Finance House, none of them was able really to practice on the basis of the experiment of Meet Ghamar. All writings at that time were predominantly, I should say, not really all, almost all, writings were based on the idea of risk sharing. If you take funds on mudaraba basis from savers, you should give it to businesses on mudaraba basis also. So take it on mudaraba and give it on mudaraba. And mudaraba really does not work. Simply, mudaraba is an old personal contract, not suitable really for collective work or for metropolitan economic activity, where in all metropolises people don't know each other, don't have trust with each other. They rarely establish trust. That's unlike the small community, village community at that time. Definitely Meet Ghamar was no more than maybe 3 or maximum 500 families. A small town, everybody knows everybody else, and so on. The 3 banks that came early, Islamic Development Bank, then the Dubai Islamic Bank, and later, 3 years later, in 1978, the Kuwait Finance House could not really provide any financing on the basis of musharaka. Especially Islamic Development Bank, and definitely until now, you can hardly find any government institution in any Muslim country that makes good feasibility study of a project, and that you can trust its management also, that it will work good and it will be honest in its working. Find me such an institution, a government institution, anywhere in the Muslim world. It is difficult to find it. And in fact, the management of IDB, especially in the early years, the president of IDB of that time is still alive, Dr. Ahmed Muhammad Ali. He is still alive, probably he's in his mid-90s now, was very conservative to the extent that he really could not find any trustworthy organization to give it on the basis of mudaraba or of even musharaka. At that time, there were later on very, very few, extremely few projects managed on musharaka basis. So the idea of mudaraba or risk sharing still prevailed, but really it was not convenient for these Islamic banks that were established. Another effect came, which was very important also, that is the effect of the Sharia scholars. When the Islamic Bank of Egypt, for instance, Faisal Islamic Bank was established. Of course, they want a Sharia scholar that give them some good image in the public. So they selected naturally a person who was the Mufti there. I think his name is Muhammad Khatir or something Khatir, who was the Mufti of Egypt. And he had a good Sharia background. And of course, his advice if he would advise any merchant or any banker, how can he make money without being indulged in haram? He would tell him, sell on credit. Well, how can I sell in credit if I don't buy? I need to buy. So this is where started that sale on credit became really the first advice of the Sharia scholars who did not have any economic background. All economists at that time, including the late Ahmad al-Najjar, were chanting risk sharing and giving mudaraba and musharaka and all that. Ahmad al-Najjar was a big loud voice in that. Another loud voice was Khurshid Ahmad, rahimahumullah, both of them. But these voices were really not heard in the practice, because in the practice the consultant were the Sharia prominent persons. Jordan Islamic Bank was saved from that because it was established by the banker who invented Murabaha, and that is Sami Hamoud. And Sami Hamoud in the 1967 and 60 up to 68 up to 1976, not 67, 1976 up to 1979 went around advising the first in the Islamic Bank, and then the Islamic Development Bank in Jeddah, and then in the other two banks, in especially Kuwait Finance House and Dubai Islamic Bank, advising them on Murabaha. If you want to really make financing in a way that is compliant with Sharia, use the Murabaha. Definitely Sami Hamoud is the father in that sense of Murabaha in our modern time, and also the father of really Islamic banking, because without Murabaha, both the two privately owned Islamic banks, Kuwait Finance House and Dubai Islamic Bank, were trading real estate instead of giving financing. They could not give any financing in their first few years. They started trading real estate, and they made good profit. I remember the late Mahmoud Abu Saud came to us in America. He was living in America, but he was consultant of Dubai Islamic Bank. He came to us saying, we made good profit in Islamic Bank. When I checked with him, he said, well, we made good profit by buying and selling lands and buildings. Well, is that banking? I asked him that question, and he had no answer. Definitely, because that is not banking. So they made good profit. He said that at that time, in that year, profit at the rate of 38% per annum, which was high profit. But anyway, the saving or the savior of Islamic banking came through Sami Hamoud at that time with his Murabaha idea. Explained it to Islamic Development Bank, then to Dubai Islamic banks, then also to the Kuwait Finance House, and they started making Murabaha. They are making some kind of banking now, financing other individuals and other companies and economic units, and taking the side of only financing, and that what made Murabaha dominant in the Muslim countries and everywhere in all Islamic banking. Now, one thing that is really interesting is how do Islamic banks finance for the last 4 or 5 now decades, how they were financing. When we look at their activities, we find them either sale, and Awofi kind of formalizes the standards of different kinds of sale. They finance on ijara that started in the 90s. There was no ijara traced before the 90s. And then they financed also rarely, very little on they financed on musharaka. Mudaraba almost really doesn't exist at all at the level of Islamic banks, especially the early Islamic banks. But where do these relationships, or the economic and legal relationships, where do they come from? Sale, whether in the murabaha form or in salam form or istisna or bay'ul ajal, or all these sale, different forms of sale, and ijara, and the rare musharaka, where do they come from? In fact, when we look, we find them existing in all commercial laws all over the world, everywhere. And they've been in commercial laws for centuries, even before the creation of commercial laws everywhere in the world, and before fiqh al-mu'amalat. In our Sharia, the practice of sale and sale on credit, and sale with deferred delivery, sale on istisna, and all these practiced in all societies throughout history. So was also the ijara was practiced, that you own a property and you give it on lease for a small amount periodically. And also people were creating businesses by putting resources together. So they came really from the commercial banks, from the market, from the real business in the market. But if we look at these sale, leasing, and musharaka, or different kind of sharing, when we look at them closely, what is the common factor between the three of them? In sale, you own a thing and sell it. In ijara, again, you own a thing and give it on leasing. And musharaka also, you own a thing along with other people or with other economic units, and produce certain things, and your profit can only be realized when you end up by selling your product, whether your products are things or services. So by sale of service or sale of things, you make the profit through musharaka and in its different kind. So the common thing really is ownership. You have to own and lease, own and sell, own and produce goods or services, and sell these goods and services. Of course, not lending, and Islamic banks don't use lending contract. Now, why they don't use lending contract? What is giving a loan? What does it do? Creates a debt, right? And if we notice that a debt does not generate any addition. So what the lending contract does, in fact, is transfer ownership from one person to another. That lending contract, it transfers the kind of the property the lender owns or owned before lending, transfer it into a debt. And while sale and leasing, and so is sharing when it ends by selling, when these transactions create additional value, the transfer of ownership itself does not create additional value. And if we think of it, we notice that the property of the lender becomes a debt. And if the property of the lender is a debt, the debt does not generate any value. Whereas the property of the lender or the property of the goods provider on credit are things that generate additional value by their nature. You own a car and give it on credit. You own a refrigerator, give it on credit. You own any property and give it on credit. Or you own a property and give it on leasing. You own a property that is by its nature able to generate additional value. In lending, you own a debt, and the debt does not generate additional value. Of course, that doesn't mean that lending is not useful. Lending is useful because it expands the degree of freedom of the borrower, and by the same token also it reduces the degree of freedom of the lender. So lending has a benefit. I don't say it doesn't have a benefit, but it creates a relationship that itself is not able to generate additional value. The benefit that creates is a degree of freedom that when I transfer some of my degree of freedom to the degree of freedom, to the quantity or the quantum of degree of freedom of the borrower will have more free hand in the market to take action. But notice again, whatever action the borrower takes, the borrower will be taking action in his own property because the nature of the lending contract transfers ownership. So we still are talking about ownership. And if ownership is transferred of what is given as a loan, whether in money or in kind, if the ownership is transferred, who deserves any income that is being generated by this ownership that is already owned by the borrower, or by the thing that is already owned by the borrower, not the lender. Of course, it is the borrower who deserves that, and not the owner, because it is an increment in his or her own property. For the creditor, when you accept to transfer your ownership to the other guy and make your replace it by a debt, by an asset that is mute by its nature, you are making a sacrifice. Of course, you are sacrificing your degree of freedom. You are not losing opportunity, what is called opportunity cost. You are not paying anything, and your property is still exactly at the same amount. There is no reduction in your property, so you did not bear any cost, and you did not lose any profit either, because an unrealized profit is not a lost profit by definition. It is unrealized anyway, only hopeful thing, and reality may be different all the time. So that brings us really to the issue of ownership that is common between these three factors, or not factors, sorry, three methodologies of finance provision which Islamic banks practiced, and which is historically an old thing. It's really not invention of Islam. And let's make it clear, although this may not be desired by some Sharia scholars who may don't like this statement, Islam did not invent sale or lease or different kinds of musharakat. And what the Sharia and what the whole story of fiqh al-mu'amalat is to refine these relationships, not really to invent them. Refine them, regulate them, put them in the appropriate way, with appropriate conditions, remove from them any nuance that may create some kind of undesired position in them. Sorry, where did I travel here? Okay. Okay. So ownership then is, you have to own in order to be able to sell. You have to own to rent, and you have to own in sharing in order to be able to produce goods and services, and through the sale of these goods and services you may make a profit. Now, definitely when we look at these, it means that ownership and not the risk. And we'll come to risk to look at it. It's not risk. No risk, neither risk sharing is the basis of generating a profit. But ownership alone is not sufficient, really. You need to own a thing that is able to generate additional value. If what you own is not able to generate additional value, you cannot claim earning of any amount. So when we talk about Islamic finance being a sector that aims at earning, it must be contributing in creating additional value. And if we look at risk, really, we notice that risk alone, take it as pure risk, simply risk not related to a property, is not a thing that is suitable anyway to be traded or to be owned. You don't own a risk, and you don't sell a risk, you don't buy a risk, or you may buy an asset that is risky. That's okay, and risk is part of life anyway. It's associated with any action or any property. Any economic unit have. Whether an economic unit takes an action that is, has risk, even natural units are also exposed to risk related to actions or properties or things. I may have a risk with my jacket, and I may have a risk with my walking. Both of them have that risk. But again, the other aspect of ownership and of action is, I may make an action and gain through this action, gain happiness or gain even money, could be in monetary terms or in economic terms, or by my property also, I may, although I am exposed to risk, I am entitled to any added value that is created in my property. So the result is that ownership gives me the entitlement to the increment that happens in my ownership. I want to say one thing, that if we look at the detailed Sharia rulings, in mudaraba, in sale, in ownership, in ijara, in everywhere, we will notice this principle going through, that the principle that if you want to earn, you need to own. And without ownership, you are not entitled to earning. We talk about finance, and finance means you own a thing, but that thing also must be able to generate additional value. If you own a thing that is not able to generate additional value, such as owning cash provided it remains in the vault, that it should not come out of that vault, definitely that is not able to generate additional value. Similarly, if you own a debt, the debt by its nature is not able to generate additional value. Yet other kind of properties may generate added value, and sometimes maybe the added value may be negative. So they may generate a loss. You may buy an item for a certain amount and sell it for a lower amount. So you may generate a loss in it, or the item with the inflation and other things, you sell it at the same amount, but its real value is now much lower than what you paid for it, etc. So real goods, and of course services also, may generate added value, but also they may generate the opposite. The added value could be negative, but definitely not risk, and not risk sharing is what generates added value. The added value is generated by the fact of ownership itself. Now, we talked about lender. We are not going to repeat it again, but what is the result? What is then, are we talking about only theory? Or really, what is wrong, in other words, with the risk sharing as a proposition being a basis of the Islamic finance? Risk sharing does not accommodate consumer finance, of course. There are some writers who try to, we can finance consumer, finance education, and then share the income of that person after being educated. It failed, really, and it makes no sense. You cannot finance consumer finance through risk sharing. But does it mean you are not developmental? And there was a theorem which was really affected to a large extent by the prevailing socialism in the 60s and 70s of the past century, in the Arab countries especially, that development means financing businesses. That's what makes growth. But everybody knows that financing consumers is also developmental, because it gives the market signal to the producers that there is need for more production. So it is, consumption is as developmental as financing businesses. And also, really, what is the objective of financing businesses other than consumption in the final analysis? As the Prophet ﷺ encouraged also consumption by saying that, well, if you don't enjoy your property, then it's not really your property. Isn't that what the Prophet said? إيش رأيك, Dr. Ozan?
I remember the hadith that actually...
Okay, so the hadith says that your property is what you enjoy, what you eat, what you wear, what you use, and also what you give as sadaqah, enjoy later. And anything that is not among these three, that you enjoy, you eat and wear and live in, etc., and give at charity, also save for your future, for the afterlife. If not any of these, then it is not your property. Isn't that encouragement of consumption also? definitely it is encouragement of concern. And we have several other hadith, يعني إن الله يحب أن يرى أثر نعمته على عبده and the like. The matter is consumption is also developmental because it gives the market signal to increasing production. Risk with or without sharing is not able to generate added value. What generates added value are the properties in finance. Without the property, added value is not generated. Risk does not fit as an object of ownership or trade. You don't own risk, pure risk, you cannot own it. It's not ownable. It's not a thing that you can really manage. Although now we create fictitious things that represent risk, like trading the index. And this is why the ruling about trading index is that index is really nothing. Nothing can be owned. It is not permissible to buy. It is not permissible to own. It's not permissible to sell. It's not permissible to trade. Similarly, the options, that was the fatwa of the OIC Fiqh Academy, and that is based really in reality on the principle of ownership, because owning an index does not mean, or units of index, does not mean you own anything that is able to generate any additional value. So is ownership of options. Although the OIC Fiqh Academy, I should say really beautifully, said this is called a financial right, but it continued, but it is not acceptable in Sharia to be purchased, owned, sold, or traded. Based on that same principle really that now we are trying to derive. Risk sharing does not accommodate the need of finance producers for definite cash flow. In the metropolitan finance provision, we need to manage cash flow. And when we give financing on risk sharing, it becomes very hectic to manage the cash flow, because you don't know what your cash flow is going to be. You don't know how much and when funds will come to you. And that is really the problematic in metropolitan finance providers. When we talk individually, one person to person, that's a different story. But again, risk sharing is not compatible with most regulatory requirements. You need to be more predictable in regulations. Risk-taking and risk-sharing is more costly than risk aversion. Of course, that's natural. So why should we prefer? Why should any normal person prefer risk-taking over risk-sharing? All people, even the risk-takers, still they prefer, and I am a risk-taker, high risk-taker, I am as a person really. We take risk because we endeavor to those who are risk-taker. Take risk because they endeavor for and they aim and hope at a much higher gain as a result of that. So when you take high risk, definitely you expect, and that's natural, you expect higher return on it. It may not happen, but the risk takers have a feeling always that with their own effort they can do it. They can succeed, they can make it. And as a risk taker, I have many experiences in that way. I have taken risk in my life, risk that could be imaginable by many others normally, but I was able to push it and succeed with it, thanks God, of course with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. preference of risk sharing is not compatible with human nature. Because for any human being, which is better? You control your own property, or another guy or girl controls your own property? Of course, controlling own property is preferable for any normal human being. Risk-return relationship, yes, it is experienced that you take more risk with the expectation of having more return, but that is not a causality relationship. It is not the risk that causes the return, rather the action or the property that is risky is the one that creates the return. It's not the risk itself, rather it is the asset. Risk has different kinds. Which kind risk sharing you want us to take? For instance, there is no way you can share ownership risk. How can you share ownership risk? And the Sharia clearly says this is impossible, and it is anti-justice to share ownership risk. For instance, in a sharing relationship, if there is a loss, do you share the loss? How do you share the loss? You share it in proportion to the ownership. In other words, each owner bears own risk, and you cannot throw part of your risk on the others. And that is anti-justice and against the normal human thinking. Risk-sharing theorem does not recognize the importance or the differences between market share and ownership, market risk, and ownership risk. Ownership risk is a necessary condition in Islamic finance, because if you own, one aspect of ownership is bearing the risk of ownership. And by the same token, you are entitled, if you own, you are entitled to the return. But the risk sharing, there's a difference between ownership risk. Do I need to bear market risk in order to gain? Not really. I may gain with my property without any market risk at all, simply by owning, and my property increased in its value. I own a property because of, as Ibn Taymiyyah says, كثرة الخلق أو قلة الرزق, that is the increase in demand or the decline in supply. My property becomes more valuable, more appreciated in the market, and it gets higher market value without making any effort in it, and without bearing any market risk, because it is my property and I did not intend to sell it anyway. So does market risk, the one that justifies the earning? No, according to the theory of ownership. Rather, what justifies the earning is the risk of ownership. And this is compatible again with the detailed ruling. Take, for instance, the hadith that you don't deserve the return of a thing that you don't get possession of. First, you don't own it, but second, you don't take possession of. You don't bear its risk. By taking possession of it, you have taken its risk. So, but is the risk that you are taking the cause of the return, or the ownership is the cause of the return, and the risk is an aspect a characteristic of that ownership, of course it is characteristic only. The last point here is that the risk sharing contradicts the human natural inclination to control own property. Okay, now I want to jump quickly to another point which relates to that. How much time do we have now?
We still have 15 minutes.
Okay.
20 minutes, sorry. 20 minutes.
Let's take quickly this point. Once we establish that ownership is really the source of, or the basis that explains finance that aims for making profit, we need to deal with definitely neither price risk, nor liquidity risk, nor credit risk is necessarily associated with justifying earning. Ownership risk is related to, but not a justifier of return. It is related to return, but it is not the justifier of return in finance. Rather, ownership is what creates the return, not the ownership risk, although it is part of the characteristic. So what justifies earning is creation or existence of increment or of added value in an owned property. This is what is consistent with maqasid and also with the individual maqasid al-sharia and with the individual rulings of sharia. So we look at it then, in my opinion, as a new theory of Islamic finance, but really not only of Islamic finance, but of Islamic economics at large. Let's take a little kind of revision or quick look at the theory of production and factors of production. Who really owns the net, the remainder in the theory of production? The net remaining amount after paying the already contracted factors of production. Who owns that final remainder, the net amount? After you pay the already contracted amounts of the other factors of production or factors of production, is it not the owner of the project, the owner of the concept that we call it project? Let's take more than one example. If we imagine a project of, say, car rental. In car rental, you rent the office, you rent the land, you rent the computer, of course, you rent the laborer who will clean the cars between, and you rent also the cars, you rent 50 cars from the car dealer. So capital is rented, labor is rented, the manager is rented, the place is rented, the land, the factors of production, all of them are rented, and you are sleeping at home. And yet who takes the profit of this project? All factors of production are rented, and they are paid for pre-contracted, based on pre-contracted base, all factors of production. And you are not part of the factors of production, because the manager takes care, call it the entrepreneur, takes care of the managing of the idea that you created, but you are the owner of that project. Of course, if there is a loss, you bear the loss of it. And that's natural. If these pre-contracted compensations of the factors of production fail to generate more return than what you pre-contracted, that will be a loss, and you bear that loss, although you are not part of the production itself. And this is then, here we have the ownership is separated really from all factors of production. In mudaraba, if mudaraba fails, is the contract of mudaraba came to be invalid legally. Who takes the return of the mudaraba? The owner of Rabbul Mal. Rabbul Mal, why? Because any increment that may have happened is owned by is generated by his property, by what he owns. So this ownership right gives him the right. And again, our fiqh says, but the mudarib entered the relationship not for free. He entered that relationship expecting some part of the return. And but if you give all the return to the owner of the principal, what do you give to the mudarib? Our fiqh, because of the principle of justice here, the mudarib, from the beginning, he did not intend to volunteer his work. Suppose he volunteered his work, and he was like wakil only and volunteered his work. So the Rabbul Mal takes everything, and here the mudarib was voluntary completely. But in mudaraba, the intention of the mudarib from the beginning was not at all to volunteer his work. So they say in fiqh, in application of the principle of justice, not in application of the entitlement right. Notice, in entitlement right, the owner takes all the profit. But in the implementation of the principle of justice, here is a person who entered a relationship without any intention of volunteering his work. He intended by his work to get compensation on it, but the contract turned out to be valid. We have it in fiqh that he deserves, or she of course, deserves the compensation of an equivalent qualification in the market price for his or her qualifications. So whether there is a profit in the final thing or a loss, it doesn't matter. When in Muzara'a, who deserves the fruits or the plants after they grow up? If the Muzara'a turn out to be invalid, who deserves that? The result of Muzara'a. Imam Sarakhsi quotes a case that 4 people made Muzara'a. One provided the seeds, another one provided the pesticides and fertilizer, the other one provided the work, activity, farming, and the landlord who provided the land. These 4 people, he said the Muzara'a becomes, this kind of Muzara'a invalid, and who owns the product, the output? The owner of the seeds, because the output is growth from the seeds. The seeds became bigger, and they created these the plants. So when you collect the plants, the seed owner takes that. But of course, on the basis of justice, on the basis of adala, that he will be required to compensate the farmer who put his effort with the intention of having a share. not free, did not intended to make it free. Same thing, he has to pay the price of the pesticides and fertilizers, he has to pay the rent of the landowner and so on. But who owns the product is the product is the growth of the property. Imam Saratsi attributes this as a hadith. The hadith is da'if really, but this is a fiqh rule. So the idea here, entitlement for return is caused by ownership of, now we need to describe it, a value-adding property. And definitely not by risk, nor by risk sharing. Now, of course, this theory, when we look at it, we notice it applies in the theory of production, so we need to really amend the theory of production as we inherited it from writers in the West and as we teach it in our schools, that factors of production and capital earns interest. I mean, capital has nothing to do with interest. What does relate interest to capital? And interest is defined in all laws in the world, by the way, I mean, in UK and in the Latin laws and in Sharia and in America. Interest is an increment on a debt, nothing other than increment on a debt. And increment in a debt, again, is exactly the same definition of Sharia. So what does it have to do with capital as a factors of production with machines? Well, definitely not. Has nothing to do, so we need to review. It is ownership-based theory of production. Same thing also in zakah. Who is required to pay zakah? Owners, right? If you don't own, you are not required to pay zakah. So again, ownership is in the Islamic social finance, and of course it is the basis of development in the economic theory. I'm not going to discuss these four. I'm mentioning them with a brief comment probably on each one of them. When we establish ownership as a theory, a basis of Islamic finance, these 4 points come out. One, you earn by owning. And this is really an important principle of justice. Is it not just that you own? If you own, you deserve any increment that happens in your property. If you own a property that does not give increments, then you take no increment. If you own a property that gives high increment, then you take the high increment, like your cow gave birth to 2 baby cows, or your cow did not give any baby cow at all, then you don't earn it. So earning by owning. The second principle is that financial assets are really not assets. In Sharia, in Islamic finance, financial assets are simply nothing. What are the financial assets? It's just nothing. We look always at what do they represent, and we apply the rule of what they represent on them. So we take them by representation also. So if they represent really pure right that is not related to production, like option, we don't recognize it. Although it is considered financial right, we don't recognize it at all. It's nothing from Sharia point of view, literally. Similarly, when you own units of an index, it's nothing. Similar to that, action, relationship, contract for the difference. What is a contract for the difference that in the market? And it exists in the Istanbul Bursa, that you agree on, suppose I am buyer and suppose you are seller, and we set a price, say for a share 100 lira. If the price goes up, as a buyer, you give me the difference per share. If the price goes down, I give you the difference per share. But as Fairuz has a song, Fairuz is a famous Arab singer in Beirut, in Lebanon.
Who doesn't know that?
Okay, it is maybe became international even. She has a couplet that she sings, it's interesting. It says, come and don't come. So this is the contract for the difference. There's no buyer and there's no seller. There's no buy and there's no sale, but we agreed on paying the difference. That is risk alone, which is not acceptable in Sharia. So we look at all these transactions really at what do they represent, and we apply what they represent on them. And we require them to represent whatever they represent only. We recognize some of them and we throw away some others, including futures, most futures. Third principle is realism. Really, when we talk about sale, lease, and sharing, aren't we talking about the real market? Simply, it's the real market. Because what is sale? Where does sale happen? Where does it take place? It is in the real market. A commodity goes from one hand to another. And this is why the OIC Fiqh Academy of Mecca said that if it is fake, the commodity really is not intended to take place, to change the hand from one hand to the other, then the contract is not acceptable. This is the way they describe the contract that is called tawarruq in the OIC Fiqh Academy, in the Fiqh Academy of Mecca. The Muslim World League Fiqh Academy said that because the commodity is not part of the contract, is really taken as a fake without intending to own and benefit from that commodity. And so it is the contract, you only use it as a vehicle, so it's not acceptable. That is the principle of realism. It works in the real market. The final thing, of course, is the moral commitment of all Islamic finance transactions, simply because Sharia is part of is based on morality. Of course, of these, there are many results. The basic idea is it means Islamic finance is finance that works only and can succeed only within the real market, with the real market transactions. Without real market transactions, there is no Islamic finance. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much for this valuable lecture. Professor, you always provide us with a holistic approach to understanding controversial subjects such as ownership. Now we will open the floor to questions via YouTube and here in the room. I would like to start with YouTube. So someone left you a comment. He said, "Nawar Dr. may Allah bless you." And we have a question from Ilyas. He said, "Is it permissible in a murabaha contract for a capital provider to appoint the customer as an agent to purchase an asset and arrange its delivery to the customer's location, while the capital provider simply transfers the funds to the manufacturer through a bank and then adds an agreed markup to the asset price to be paid later by the customer according to agreed terms?"
The customer is going to pay the finance provider later, whatever the agreed terms, installment or anything else. What is wrong with appointing an agent? And the agent can be any person who is mature and above the year of 18 and so on, be it the customer or be it any other person. What is wrong with that? There can't be any wrong really with it. And I see the question is kind of doubting about what many Islamic banks do. And what Islamic banks do in this regard is really correct and fair rather, because you can imagine an Islamic bank cannot walk to the supplier and take delivery, take a case for buying a car to a customer. Of course, the Islamic bank is not able to work because we need a natural person to go and take delivery from the supplier. And what is wrong in making the agent being an employee of the bank, or the customer himself, or even a stranger, or the supplier also. The supplier can be the agent of the bank to give delivery. I buy it from the supplier and I authorize the supplier, please give delivery to X. So what is, there's nothing wrong with all these arrangements.
Maybe he asked before because of the misconception of the fictitious ownership of the asset.
What establishes ownership is the contract of buying and supplemented by delivery. Because without taking delivery, and taking delivery of course can be done by the agent, and an abstract person, a legal person like a bank, cannot take delivery except through a natural person. Always. So a natural person, be it the customer, being a stranger, or be it an employee of the bank, doesn't make a difference.
Okay. So another question is about the ownership and the taxation. Now we said we have to enjoy what we have, like owning the property, the food, etc. But sometimes in a lot of countries nowadays, across the world, all over the world, it makes governments are making ownership of houses a little bit more complicated because of the taxation. So sometimes staying in a rented house is more affordable from a financial perspective than just buying your own house and staying on it, because you will have to pay extra taxes every single time when there is a raise on the level of taxes. So a lot of people are choosing to say, just let me stay in the rent, especially the Western world, better than just owning the house and paying each time the extra amount of taxes.
And I don't see this is a question that relates to the subject we are discussing. Taxes are founded on the basis of either necessity or collective obligation, fard al-kifaya. Because definitely governments, all governments in the world, in Muslim majority or Muslim minority countries, provide many actions, and they take many responsibilities that are costly, that need money, need resources. And if the economy, the society, the country doesn't have resources that it can depend on, like oil or similar minerals, etc., that are, from Sharia point of view, are owned by the whole society and should not be owned by private persons. And the government is the one that represents the whole society. If there are not enough resources of that kind, then of course there must be taxes. And taxes will be forced on people, should be with adala, with justice, in relation to their taxability, that is ability to pay tax. So that depends on their wealth and income both together. There are many injustices in many tax systems in the world. For instance, in America, the tax is paid essentially on income, and there are taxes on certain kind of properties, like cars, for instance. You pay a small amount of tax on it, but on certain other kinds of properties, there are no taxes at all. And that creates great deal of injustice in the American tax system. Financial assets, for instance, that are a lot more than the construction assets, the real estate assets. Now in America, financial assets are not subject to tax, but real estate assets are subject to tax, which is local, though not federal. The income tax is federal, but there is no property tax federal for instance. So there is a lot of injustices in the tax systems in many countries, not only in America alone. But taxes are, their objective is completely different. They have nothing with the ownership and with what we are discussing. Yes, you have to pay tax as a member of that society.
He means
But
ownership
we have to pay tax on our income and on our property as members of the society. Definitely the tax systems must be based on justice, but unfortunately this is not always the case. Islam requires it to be just. Would there be taxes in Muslim, completely Islamic economy and Islamic country that implements all the system of Islam on all aspects? Yes, there may be. Depend on the resources that are available to the whole society. If there aren't resources adequate to pay for all the expenses of the government budget, there should be taxes, and taxes should be based on the ability, on the principle of fard al-kifaya, that is the collective obligation.
Thank you for your detailed answer. Do we have any questions here?
Thank you very much, sir, for this thought-provoking conference. Well, for several months I have a question in my mind. So, you said, one of the several features of ownership is transferability. And you said that when you lend something, you transfer its ownership. Well, this is a classical, actually, saying. But if I transfer the ownership by lending, on what ground I receive it back, I call it back. It's no longer my ownership. I'm under my ownership. I no longer own it. So how come I call it back?
When you transfer your ownership, in fact, you are transforming it. Not only transferring it into another person, you are transforming. You are still owner of the same amount, but you own a debt on that person.
So how come?
I mean, you had
both me and him are the owner?
No, because he owns the money that you gave him, and now it is in his pocket, and you own a debt. What is a debt? Can you define for me the debt?
That was the answer I was waiting for. Thank you very much. Because after thinking
but
a lot,
I'd like you to define the debt, please. What is a debt?
Thank you very much. I got my answer. Because we divide ownership classically into three sub-branches: milk al-raqaba, milk al-manfa, milk al-intifa. But I found in some sources, rarely actually, milk al-dayn. So I began to think that I still keep milk al-dayn, but milk al-raqaba passes to, or is transferred to the borrower.
But these three kinds of milk that are mentioned in fiqh, milk al-raqaba, milk al-manfa'a, milk al-intifa', these apply to things. They don't apply to the abstract. Dayn is by definition is an abstract. It's like love. Love is an abstract between two persons. So dayn is an abstract relationship between two persons, but it is a real property, a real thing. But that real property is abstract. And we have nowadays especially many other abstract properties also. When you own a computer program, it is abstract. What is it? What is a computer program? It's only an abstract thing. You may have it in your mind and repeat it to anybody and rent it and put it in a certain way that really the video you give him to make it is maybe a $10 value, but really you sell it for 100,000. You are selling the idea, And ideas are valuable. Now, in an article that was recently published in the journal Islamic Economic that come from the school of, in Ankara, School of Social Sciences, University of Social Sciences, I published an article which came this summer, really, this past summer, 2025, about, in Mudaraba, in fact, I denied the idea and I refused the idea that is said in our fiqh books, classical fiqh books, that in Mudaraba it's partnership between capital and labor. No, it's partnership between two kinds of capital. Ownership of money and ownership of skills. We give the Mudarib because he has skills. We don't take any person as a Mudarib. And the Mudarib, as in fiqh books, has the right to hire laborer. So he's not a laborer. How come you call him in fiqh laborer? He's not laborer. He's an owner of intellect. He has intellectual property that he contributes to this project, and by virtue of the intellectual properties, he is a partial owner of the project, the whole concept that they do together. By this ownership, he deserves the remainder, being an owner. Otherwise, he contracts other factors of production. So there are many abstract properties, intellectual property, of course, computer program is an intellectual property. Dain is also an interpersonal relationship, abstract. So these are not really things. The three kinds of ownership, these apply to things only, to material things. But there's no raqaba here. In a debt or in a computer program or in intellect. When I wrote a book, what do I own? The authorship right, that's an abstract right, really. It's not, I don't own the pages or the ink and the papers on which it is written.
I don't know how you define abstract, because the word abstract is abstract.
Yes.
But, I mean, does it include potential?
No, it's not potential, it's real. I mean, look at the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, يعني من أخذ أموال الناس ليردها أعانه الله ومن أخذها ليأكلها يعني يعذبه الله يعني نتيجته خاطئة. All religions, not only the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, recognize the abstract property, a dain. You own a dain and you put it in your balance sheet. Dain on so and so, debt on so and so. Probably the word debt came from the word dain, probably. God knows.
Let me explain my last question. You know, since you like to give the example of Mudaraba, let's go through it. Okay, there is Rabbul Mal and there is an Am. What Rabbul Mal gives? Something real, huh? Something concrete. That is principle or capital or whatever you like to call it. And what the agent puts in is his potential labor. It is not real at the moment.
No.
When, I mean, by moment I mean when they sign the contract, the labor is potential,
No.
not real.
No.
Why not?
I don't agree with you. Why do I select X and not Y as the Mudari? Why do I take X and not Y? Because X is an expert. Because I think X is going to make profit.
What does it...
It is his abilities that matters. His skills, his knowledge, his past experience.
They are all potential.
All these make a property. It's not potential. It's a real property that he has embodied in him or her. Embodied in the person. No, it's not potential. No. I mean, why do I take X and not Y? And why do I allow also and in fiqh, the mudarib to hire laborer. Or they say he can hire laborer provided that they do actions that are not part of his own action. So what is his own actions and what is the actions that other laborers can do? See the point? Yani, it's kind of vague.
Whether the labor is qualified or
it is vague
qualified
in
or
our
not
fiqh.
qualified.
In our classical fiqh, it is vague. It needs to be complemented and explained. And I really suggest, please look at that article. It's in Arabic.
Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe we may continue this discussion another day, inshallah. Thank you again, dear professor, and hope to see you again, inshallah, amongst us in a very near time. Upon that, I wish you a very blessed Ramadan. And dear attendees, thank you for your attention and for your time. And wish you all a blessed Ramadan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much.